At Levon Helm's funeral in 2012, the pews were full of legends. Bob Dylan sent flowers. Eric Clapton called with condolences. Garth Hudson sat in the front row, shoulders hunched with grief. Rick Danko's widow attended, remembering better days. Musicians, family, and fans packed the church to mourn the man whose voice had given soul to songs like The Weight and The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down. But one seat was deliberately left empty, Robbie Robertson's. The man who wrote the songs wasn't welcome to mourn the voice that sang them. Robertson in Los Angeles heard the news of Levon's death, throat cancer finally silencing that raw, earth-born voice, and wept alone in his home. He'd believed, foolishly perhaps, that there would be time to talk, time to explain, time to rebuild what had been shattered decades ago. But Levon Helm died on April 19, 2012, taking his fury with him, leaving Robertson to carry something heavier than any song he'd ever written. The knowledge that his oldest friend, his brother-in-arms, had gone to the grave hating him. No apology would be heard now. No explanation would matter. The man who'd sung those prophetic words, "Take a load off Fanny and you put the load right on me," was gone. And Robertson understood with terrible clarity that he'd be carrying that load alone for whatever years remained. 11 years later, on August 9, 2023, Robbie Robertson died at 80 in Los Angeles. The obituaries were respectful, even celebratory. "Architect of Americana," read one headline. "The soul of the band," declared another. Martin Scorsese released a heartfelt statement calling Robertson a dear friend and one of the great songwriters. Musicians praised his genius, his vision, his contributions to American music. But underneath every tribute, in comment sections and music forums and long-running debates among fans, the same question persisted: was Robbie Robertson the band's brilliant architect, or the calculating survivor who'd stolen credit from his brothers and rewritten history after they were too dead or broken to defend themselves? The question haunted him to his last breath because the answer wasn't simple. Both things could be true simultaneously, and probably were. Robertson was genuinely brilliant, a songwriter who'd captured something essential about American mythology. But he'd also taken more credit than he deserved, controlled the narrative, lived comfortably on royalties while his former bandmates struggled and died young. He was the architect, and the thief, the genius, and the betrayer. The last man standing because he'd been smart enough, or ruthless enough, to walk away before the ship went down, leaving his brothers to drown while he watched from shore and later wrote a best-selling memoir about how tragic it all was. But to understand how a brotherhood became a blood feud, how music that preached unity ended in such bitter division, we need to go back to the beginning. To Toronto, 1943, to a boy named Jaime Royal Robertson who never quite belonged anywhere and spent his life searching for a home he'd never find. Jaime Royal Robertson was born July 5, 1943 in Toronto, Canada, though he wouldn't learn the full truth about his origins until adolescence. His mother, Rosemary Dolly Chrysler, was Mohawk from the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario. His biological father was Alexander David Klegerman, a Jewish professional gambler who'd had a brief affair with Rosemary. But young Jaime grew up believing his stepfather, James Patrick Robertson, was his real father. The truth, that he was the product of a passionate but temporary relationship, that his heritage was this complicated fusion of indigenous and Jewish blood, wouldn't be revealed until he was a teenager searching for identity in a world that seemed to have no clear place for him. That sense of displacement, of existing between worlds, would define everything that followed. He wasn't fully Mohawk, wasn't fully Jewish, wasn't fully Canadian, wasn't fully American when he later moved south. He existed in the spaces between identities which either made him uniquely positioned to understand cultural crossroads or eternally homeless, depending on perspective. What he discovered early was that music could be a home when geography and bloodlines failed. Music didn't interrogate your ancestry, it only asked if you could play. By age 15, Robertson was already performing in Toronto bars, lying about his age, playing rockabilly and early rock with a precision that got him noticed. His guitar work had an architectural quality, structured, carefully constructed, nothing wasted. In 1960, at 17, he joined Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks, a wild rockabilly band touring relentlessly through the American South and Ontario. It was brutal, educational, transformative. Robertson learned to play for drunk crowds in dangerous bars, learned to survive on the road, learned that music could be transcendent art and blue-collar work simultaneously. The other Hawks became his family in ways Blood never had. Levon Helm on drums and vocals, older from Arkansas with a voice that sounded like it came from the Delta itself, rough and honest and deeply American. Rick Danko on bass, easygoing, talented, warm. Richard Manuel on piano and vocals, extraordinarily gifted, fragile, prone to darkness. Garth Hudson on organ, the musical genius of the group, classically trained, able to play anything. They were brothers in the way only touring musicians can be. Sharing motel rooms, sharing stages, sharing the peculiar intimacy of life on the road. Robertson and Helm grew particularly close. They were opposites. Robertson cerebral and calculating, Helm emotional and instinctive, but they fit together, completing each other, or so Robertson believed. In 1965, Bob Dylan found them, or they found Dylan. The story shifts depending on who tells it, which should have been the first warning. Dylan needed a backing band for his controversial transition from folk to electric rock. The Hawks, minus Ronnie Hawkins, who they'd left behind, became that band. They backed Dylan at the infamous Newport Folk Festival, where half the audience booed Dylan for betraying folk purity by plugging in. They toured with him through 1966, facing hostile crowds every night, people who saw Electric Dylan as cultural treason. But something extraordinary was happening. A new sound was being forged, a fusion of rock's power with folk's storytelling and country's honesty. It was uniquely American but crafted by outsiders, a Canadian and 4 Americans backing a Jewish folk poet remaking himself as a rock prophet. Could anyone have predicted this brotherhood would end in such bitter betrayal? The signs were there, barely visible. Even then, Robertson was positioning himself as the group's spokesman, the one who dealt with managers and record labels and press. The others were content to play, to create, to live in the moment. Robertson was thinking ahead, architecting not just songs but careers, futures, legacies. Some called it leadership. Others would later call it manipulation. In 1967, they retreated to Woodstock, New York, recording in the basement of a house that would become legendary. The music they made there, eventually released as the Basement Tapes, was unlike anything in rock. Loose, mysterious, steeped in American mythology and biblical imagery. They stopped being Dylan's backing band and became the band, a name so self-assured it needed no qualifier. Their debut album, Music from Big Pink, released in 1968, stunned the music world. Songs Robertson wrote felt ancient and modern simultaneously, as if they'd always existed but were just now being discovered. The weight became their signature. Robertson's lyric painted surreal portraits of characters in a mythical town called Nazareth, Crazy Chester, Miss Fanny, Luke, people who existed nowhere but felt real everywhere. Take a load off Fanny and you put the load right on me. The refrain was simple, haunting, infinitely interpretable. About burden sharing, community, the impossibility of lightening someone else's load without taking it on yourself. Robertson never fully explained, which made the song more powerful, but looking back it feels like prophecy. He wrote about loads being transferred, about one person carrying what others couldn't. He didn't know he was writing his own future. Their second album, The Band, 1969, cemented their status as something unprecedented. A group that sounded like they'd been playing together for generations, channeling American history, the Civil War, Reconstruction, rural hardship, spiritual longing, with eerie authenticity. The night they drove Old Dixie down was particularly astonishing. Robertson, a Canadian of Mohawk and Jewish heritage, writing from the perspective of a defeated Confederate soldier with such empathy that Southerners believed it had been written by one of their own. Levon's vocal performance made it transcendent, his Arkansas drawl lending credibility to Robertson's imagined South. This was Robertson's genius, inhabiting American mythology so completely that people forgot he was an outsider looking in, crafting images of a country he'd observed but never quite belonged to. He was writing songs about a world he'd never lived in, but somehow they became truth. Not his truth, but everyone's truth, which is the ultimate magic of great art. Behind all that critical acclaim and apparent brotherhood, was there unbearable resentment building? Absolutely. Because here's where the story gets complicated and ugly. Robertson claimed to have written most of the band's songs, the lyrics certainly often the melodies. Album credits listed him as sole or primary writer, which meant he received the royalties, the recognition, the legacy of being the band's creative genius. The others were credited as performers, skilled musicians bringing Robertson's visions to life. But was that accurate? Levon would later claim that many songs emerged from jam sessions, that melodies and arrangements came collectively, that Robertson would take those group creations, write lyrics, then claim sole authorship. Specific songs became battlegrounds. The Weight, Helm insisted the melody came from a group jam, that Robertson only added lyrics later but took full credit. Up on Cripple Creek, the distinctive clavinet line was Garth Hudson's innovation, but Robertson was listed as sole writer. Chest Fever, another Hudson composition that somehow ended up credited to Robertson. Song after song, the pattern repeated, collective creation during rehearsals and jam sessions, Robertson writing lyrics and claiming authorship, the others receiving nothing beyond performance fees. The financial disparity was stark and grew worse over time. When royalty checks arrived, Robertson's could be tens of thousands of dollars for a single quarter. The others received their performance fees, decent money but nothing like songwriting royalties. As the years passed and the band's music became classic rock staples played endlessly on radio and in films, Robertson's income grew exponentially while the others stayed relatively flat. By the mid-1970s, Robertson was financially secure for life. The others were still working musicians dependent on touring and session work to pay mortgages and support families. Helm began questioning the credits privately, then more openly. He'd confront Robertson. "I remember when we wrote that song. All of us together in the basement. How is your name the only one on it?" Robertson's response was always the same. He'd written the lyrics, shaped the songs into their final form, done the work that made them commercially viable. The others had contributed as musicians, invaluable contributions, yes, but not as songwriters. The distinction seemed clear to Robertson, insulting to Helm. How do you separate a song's melody from its arrangement, its feel from its structure, the groove from the composition? Robertson drew clean lines. Helm saw only theft disguised as clarity. The resentment poisoned everything. Recording sessions became tense. Touring felt like obligation rather than joy. The creative spark that had made music from Big Pink and the band so extraordinary was gone, replaced by professional competence and barely concealed hostility. Manuel turned increasingly to alcohol, drowning in depression he couldn't articulate. Danko's heroin use intensified. Hudson withdrew into his keyboards, avoiding confrontation. And Helm's anger at Robertson grew from frustration to fury to something harder and colder, a conviction that his brother had betrayed him, stolen from him, built a fortune on songs that should have enriched all of them equally, By the mid-1970s, the band was fracturing. Richard Manuel's alcoholism was destroying him. Rick Danko was using heroin. Levon's anger at Robertson was becoming impossible to ignore. They were touring less, recording albums that felt tired. The dynamic had calcified, Robertson holding power, controlling the narrative, having the record label's confidence, making final decisions, while the others felt increasingly like hired hands in their own band. When royalty checks arrived, Robertson's were substantial. The others received performance fees. The disparity bred resentment that festered like an infected wound. In 1976, Robertson made the unilateral decision. The band would do one final concert, then disband. He framed it as necessary for everyone's health and safety, claimed they were burning out, said it was time to stop before someone died. The others, particularly Helm, saw it differently. They needed the touring income. Robertson, comfortable on songwriting royalties, could afford to quit. They couldn't. The decision to end the band wasn't collective. It was Robertson's, presented as inevitable, and the others had to accept it or be left behind anyway. The final concert was held November 25, 1976 at Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco. Billed as the last waltz, it featured an astonishing roster of guests: Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, Van Morrison, Muddy Waters, rock royalty paying tribute. Martin Scorsese filmed it, turning the concert into what many consider the greatest rock documentary ever made. Released in 1978, The Last Waltz is beautiful, elegiac, capturing the band at their peak even as that peak was ending. But the filming itself was fraught with tension invisible to cameras. Scorsese, Robertson's close friend, gave Robertson preferential treatment in every frame. The camera lingered on Robertson's face, his guitar work, his moments with guest stars. Helm was often in shadow, his drumming shown in quick cuts rather than sustained shots. When the film was edited, Robertson had final say on what stayed and what was cut. Interviews featured Robertson explaining the band's history, their decision to end, their legacy. Presented as definitive truth when it was really one man's perspective. Helm felt erased from his own farewell, watching Robertson orchestrate not just the concert but its documentation. Ensuring that history would remember the band through Robertson's eyes. Watch Robertson closely in that film. His face is composed, almost cold in its calculation. He's aware of cameras, aware of history being made, aware that this concert, his decision, is cementing his legacy as the visionary leader who knew when to walk away. He stands center stage with Dylan, trades licks with Clapton, harmonizes with Neil Young. Meanwhile, Helm looks devastated, barely holding together, understanding that his livelihood is ending for reasons unrelated to music and everything to do with Robertson's desire to move on. The other members look exhausted, beaten, ready for it to be over. Only Robertson looks like he's exactly where he wants to be, in control, making history, already planning his next act. The concert ended, the cameras stopped rolling, and the band, as a working unit, as a brotherhood, died that night. What happened next was worse than anyone imagined. Did this moment mark their peak, or reveal how broken they'd become? Both. The Last Waltz immortalized the band, but it also exposed the rot. This wasn't a brotherhood deciding collectively to end. It was one man unilaterally ending something four others still needed, then filming that ending as if it were noble sacrifice rather than abandonment. Robertson would later claim he was saving the band, preventing them from self-destructing on the road. Helm would say Robertson killed the band to preserve his own reputation, to escape before the decline became too obvious. After The Last Waltz, the members scattered. Robertson moved to Los Angeles, began scoring films with Scorsese, released solo albums that sold modestly, became a respected elder statesman. He was comfortable, successful, his legacy secure. The others struggled. Richard Manuel, Depressed and alcoholic, hanged himself in a Florida motel room in 1986. Rick Danko, his body destroyed by decades of drug abuse, died of heart failure in 1999. Garth Hudson survived but lived quietly, largely forgotten by mainstream audiences. Manuel's suicide devastated everyone who'd known him. He'd been the most fragile, the most gifted vocalist, a man whose sensitivity made him brilliant on stage and unbearable off it. In the decades since the last waltz, he'd spiraled, drinking to blackout most nights, barely able to perform when the band occasionally reunited without Robertson. On March 4, 1986, after a show in Winter Park, Florida, Manuel returned to his motel room and hanged himself. He was 42. Friends said he'd been despondent for years, that ending the band had taken away the only structure that kept him functional, that without regular work he'd lost his reason to stay sober. Robertson heard the news in Los Angeles. He attended the funeral, said the right things, felt genuinely devastated. But he also felt something darker that he couldn't quite name. Guilt mixed with defensiveness. Had ending the band contributed to Manuel's death? Would Richard still be alive if they'd kept touring, kept working, kept the structure intact? Robertson told himself no, told himself Manuel's demons were his own, that you couldn't keep a band together just to keep one member from self-destruction. But the question haunted him. If they'd stayed together, would Richard have survived? Rick Danko's death in 1999 was slower, more predictable. Years of heroin and alcohol had ravaged his body. By his 50s, he looked ancient, bloated, exhausted, barely able to climb stairs without wheezing. He'd continued performing with various versions of the band. Without Robertson, with Levon playing county fairs and small theaters, trying to make a living from songs he hadn't been credited for writing. When he died on December 10, 1999 at 56, it was almost a mercy. His heart simply gave up, tired of fighting chemicals and time and disappointment. Robertson sent flowers. He didn't attend the funeral. Levon's presence made it impossible, the hostility too public, too raw. But he mourned privately, remembering Rick as he'd been in the early days. Talented, funny, warm, the glue that held personalities together. Now 2 of his brothers were gone, both dead too young, both struggling financially when they died while Robertson lived comfortably in a Los Angeles mansion. The guilt was becoming unbearable, but so was the defensiveness. He'd made decisions he believed were right. He'd taken care of his own career. Was he responsible for their choices, their addictions, their inability to adapt after the band ended? He didn't think so. But thinking it didn't make the guilt disappear. And Levon Helm? He kept touring because he had to. He didn't have Robertson's royalty income. In the 1990s and 2000s, he discovered or came to believe that he'd been systematically cheated out of proper songwriting credits. He began speaking publicly, calling Robertson a thief and manipulator who'd stolen credit for songs the entire band had created. His autobiography portrayed Robertson as selfish and calculating. When Robertson published his own memoir, Testimony, in 2016, Helm's widow released a statement saying Levon had refused reconciliation because Robertson never admitted his role in the band's destruction. But Levon's fury went deeper than financial grievance. It was about erasure, about watching Robertson become the voice of the band in every documentary, every interview, every historical retrospective. It was about the last waltz being shown as Robertson's triumph, rather than the band's farewell. It was about Robertson's memoir presenting one version of history, his version, while Levon and the others were too dead or too tired to offer alternatives. Levon had throat cancer by the 2000s, his magnificent voice being destroyed by disease, and even as he was dying, he refused to forgive Robertson. The bitterness had calcified into something harder than anger, a bone-deep conviction that his brother had betrayed him and would never, ever admit it. The feud became public, bitter, irreconcilable. Reunion proposals died because Helm refused to play with Robertson. Every interview about the band included questions about the credit dispute. Music journalists took sides, some defending Robertson's legal rights to the credits, others sympathizing with Helm's claims of collective authorship. Fans argued endlessly online. The shadow of their destroyed brotherhood hung over everything, impossible to escape. And Robertson? He maintained his position through it all. The credits were accurate. He'd written the songs. History would vindicate him. In interviews, when pressed about Helm's accusations, he'd say he wished Levon could find peace, a phrase that infuriated Helm further because it suggested Helm's anger was irrational rather than justified. Robertson seemed genuinely mystified by the depth of Helm's rage, as if he couldn't understand why proper legal credits would generate such personal fury. But that incomprehension was itself revealing. Robertson saw music as intellectual property, credits as legal facts, royalties as earned income. Helm saw music as collective creation, credits as acknowledgement of brotherhood, royalties as shared reward for shared work. They were speaking different languages, and neither could hear the other anymore. In his final decade, as throat cancer slowly killed him, Levon held midnight ramble concerts at his home in Woodstock. Intimate performances for small crowds, a way to make money and keep playing despite his failing voice. Musicians would come pay tribute, sit in, honor the man who'd given so much to American music. Robertson was never invited, never mentioned except in coded references to betrayal and theft. When music journalists would ask Levon about reconciliation, his answer never varied. Some things can't be forgiven. Some wounds don't heal. Can anyone escape the shadow of their darkest moments? Robertson tried. His second act was genuinely successful. Film scores for Scorsese's greatest works, Raging Bull, The King of Comedy, Casino, The Irishman, Killers of the Flower Moon. Solo albums, collaborations, induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But Levon's accusations followed him everywhere, an inescapable ghost. Every accolade was shadowed by the question, at what cost? When Levon died on April 19, 2012, Robertson's public statement was careful, measured, full of vague praise and vaguer regret. He called Helm one of the most talented musicians and said his voice would echo for eternity. But he didn't apologize. He didn't admit wrongdoing. He maintained that the credits were fair, that he'd written the songs, that complicated truths were being simplified into false narratives. Maybe he was right. Maybe the truth was more nuanced than either man could articulate. But nuance doesn't heal wounds. And the wound between Robertson and Helm never healed. It just stopped bleeding when Helm died, leaving Robertson to live with the scar. In his final years, Robertson continued working. He scored Killers of the Flower Moon, 2023, Scorsese's epic about the murders of Osage Nation members. Fitting that one of his last works addressed indigenous tragedy, given his own Mohawk heritage. He gave interviews promoting the film, talking about craft and legacy. Journalists inevitably asked about the band, about Levon, about the accusations. Robertson's answers never varied, proud of the music, sad about how things ended, but firm in his belief that he'd acted correctly, that the credits were accurate, that he'd been unfairly vilified. When he died on August 9, 2023, tributes poured in. Scorsese mourned a dear friend. Dylan sent condolences. Van Morrison called him a true original. But in the spaces between tributes, the debate continued. Was he genius or thief? Architect or betrayer? And somewhere in all that noise was the simple, sad truth. Robbie Robertson was the last man standing from the band, the only one left to tell the story, and the story he told might not have been the whole truth, but it was the only version that would survive because everyone else was gone. Were powerful forces involved in this tragedy? Not external conspiracies, but internal rot, ego, money, the impossibility of 5 strong personalities staying aligned across decades, the corrosive effect of one person controlling the narrative. The band didn't fail because anyone was evil. They failed because Robertson was ambitious and Helm was proud, because credits mattered more than they should have, because being the architect meant making decisions others resented, because brotherhood is easy when you're young and struggling but becomes impossible when success forces you to divide credit and money and glory unequally. The legacy Robertson left is magnificent and contested. The Wait, the night they drove Old Dixie down, up on Cripple Creek, permanent fixtures of American music covered endlessly, instantly recognizable, timeless. The Last Waltz remains the gold standard for concert films. His guitar work influenced generations. His songwriting proved rock could be intelligent, literary, steeped in history without being pretentious. He demonstrated that mythology and modernity could coexist in 3-minute songs, but that legacy is forever complicated by accusations, by Levon's fury, by bandmates dying young and broken while Robertson lived comfortably into old age. You can't separate the music from the men who made it, can't celebrate Robertson's genius without acknowledging the cost others paid. The greatest trick he pulled wasn't writing those songs, it was convincing the world he wrote them alone, that the band was his vision rather than a collective creation, that he deserved the credit and royalties while others deserved, what? Gratitude for bringing his vision to life? If you create something immortal but lose every brother who built it with you, have you succeeded or have you failed? For Robertson, the answer was both. He achieved everything an artist could want: fame, respect, financial security, lasting influence. But he paid for it with the thing he'd been searching for since childhood: belonging. That mixed heritage boy from Toronto who never quite fit anywhere, who found home in the band, who believed they were brothers. He lost that home when he made himself the architect. Architects stand apart, seeing the whole structure while workers see individual tasks. Architects are essential but isolated, respected but not loved. Robertson lived 47 years after The Last Waltz, long enough to see the band's music become classic, to watch younger musicians cite him as influence, to receive every honor the music world could bestow. But he lived those decades knowing Levon Helm died hating him, knowing Richard Manuel and Rick Danko died young and struggling, knowing the brotherhood he'd sung about in The Wait had collapsed under the weight of his ambition and their resentment. Was Robbie Robertson the band's architect or its betrayer? Or is the tragic truth that he was both? He was the architect, genuinely brilliant, genuinely visionary, genuinely responsible for much of what made the band transcendent. And he was the betrayer, taking more credit than he deserved, controlling the narrative, living comfortably while former brothers died badly. These truths don't contradict. They coexist uncomfortably in the same man, the same legacy, the same songs that play long after everyone who created them is gone. Robbie Robertson wrote The Wait. He sang about taking loads off others and putting them on yourself. He spent 40 years carrying a load nobody else could see. The guilt of surviving when brothers die hating you. The burden of being right and wrong simultaneously. The impossibility of proving your truth when everyone who could confirm or deny it is dead. The song never explained what happens after you take on that load. It never mentioned that some weights you carry until you die. That being the last man standing means you're alone with the accumulated weight of all the men who fell. He was born Jaime Royal Robertson, searching for home. He became Robbie Robertson, architect of American mythology. He died at 80, surrounded by family but haunted by ghosts. Levon's fury, Richard's suicide, Rick's wasted death. The brotherhood that should have lasted forever but barely survived 15 years. His music will endure. Arguments about credit will endure. And somewhere between those eternities is a man who wrote beautiful myths about America and uncomfortable truths about ambition, who built something magnificent and destroyed the relationships that made it possible, who carried the weight until the very end. Robbie Robertson built the band's immortal songs. but he carried until his death the weight of being the last man standing in a brotherhood broken beyond repair. Alone at the end, triumphant and tragic. Unable to put down the load even when his body finally failed and the weight became more than any human, architect or thief, genius or betrayer could bear.